So when did you realize politics is something that you want to get involved in?
After 9/11, I would say I was in high school, a freshman at the time. And obviously what happened on 9/11 was terrible. But then similar to what I think Israel is experiencing right now, suddenly you have the people in charge making some pretty irresponsible decisions that obviously did drag us into wars that we shouldn't have been fighting in for as long as we fought in them. Invading Iraq was outrageous to me. I remember in English class, I would have like a newspaper. I would hide my newspaper in like my binder or a book. And as the class was doing whatever assignment, like I found high school like not challenging and super boring. So I was reading the New York Times, and I remember this one article I was reading in English class was quoting Bill Kristol, and he was a huge continues to be a huge war hawk, but back then he was really pushing for us to invade Iraq. And I just remember being like so like irritated by him and frustrated by him and feeling like I have no voice. And then fast forward to, I believe it was like 2018 or 2019, I had an opportunity to debate him at like Politicon, which was nice. So I've always been into politics as soon as I was like old enough to even understand what politics is.
But when did you decide to turn that into a career?
I'd never really thought I was going to have a career specifically in political news, but I wanted to be in media and journalism starting from like middle school. My mom asked me like, what do you want to be? And I thought I wanted to be an actress. And she's like, nope, you're not, we're not going to let that happen. Right. And my parents are, they're Armenian immigrants and they're very conservative in some ways. And that's one of the ways they were very conservative. They're like, you'll be it's called puchatsats, which means like ruined, right? You'll be a ruined woman, like if you become an actress. So they're like, no, we're not going to allow that. So then I was talking to my mom more about like what kind of careers I might be interested in. She mentioned that I loved watching ABC's 2020 when Barbara Walters was a host. And once she said that, I was like, oh yeah, journalist. I want to do journalism. And from that moment on, that was what I pursued. And then, that all manifested in ways that I didn't expect. But ultimately, I guess I'm happy doing what I'm doing.
So what was your first gig in journalism?
First gig in journalism was for KNX 1070, which at the time was a news radio station.
I remember that.
Yeah.
My mom would listen to that.
Yeah, owned by CBS.
On the way to school. My God, KNX 1070, news radio, whatever. I still remember that.
They hired me out of college as like an assistant producer. It was awful. It was an awful job. Pay? No, it was terrible. It was like $10 an hour.
$10 an hour. When was this?
This was I guess at the time it wasn't that bad, but it was 2007.
Okay.
Yeah, so $10 an hour. But the worst part about it was I always got the night shifts. So I would have to be in at 3, and I'd work from like 3 to about 10 in the morning.
Wait, 3 a.m.?
3 a.m., yeah.
Wow.
It was bad. And like the editor that I had to work with was really mean and like would like curse me out over any little thing. He'd ask me to print something for him, which of course I'll oblige. But in the middle of that, I'm taking a live feed from a reporter who's on the field. So I have to finish that before I print out his papers. And I remember one time, I guess I took too long. He started like cussing me out in the middle of the newsroom. And I emailed the news director about it. I was like, hey, I don't really like being treated like this. And she's like, you need to be an adult. This is an adult workplace. This is a newsroom. And I was like, okay. I thought that's what it was supposed to be like. Then I find out that this show called The Young Turks needs like a temporary fill-in for one of their producers. One of my colleagues at KNX reached out to me about it, asked me if I was interested. I was planning on like a month-long trip to Europe. And then after that, I was going to go to grad school and try to figure out what I wanted to do after that because my experience at KNX was so awful. I didn't think I wanted to do journalism anymore. But then I decided to take that temp job at TYT because it was just 2 weeks and I needed a little bit of extra money for my trip. And I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. And I didn't want to leave after that.
So what was the difference working with TYT than KNX?
Well, it was creative. The news coverage was more honest. There were no scripts, which I appreciated. At KNX, you have a team of news writers who take stories from AP or Reuters, the wire services. They just rewrite it for broadcast. And then like 15 minutes before the broadcast, the anchor shows up and just regurgitates, reads.
Does the anchor know anything about what they're saying?
I don't want to throw the anchors under the bus. They might be super knowledgeable, but they don't need to do any of that grunt work of actually writing what they're going to be reading themselves. But
what happens if they disagree with something that they're given to say?
Well, at that time, remember, opinion journalism was a lot more rare. So there was no opinion or analysis. It was just straight news, like a straight news broadcast, which I also found kind of boring because at that time, especially, no one was willing to outright criticize what Bush was doing. This was during the Bush administration. And I was like, there are war crimes being committed. Also, there's illegal wiretapping into Americans that shouldn't be happening. Like, there were all sorts of crazy things happening. And I feel like if it got any coverage in the media, it would be in print news and no one would read it. Or it would just be like a straight news broadcast type situation where it was presented as if it was normal, right? Like, you know, the Bush administration's doing this and all right, next story, that kind of thing.
Sure.
It just felt hollow. All of it felt hollow and boring, no creativity, nothing to look forward to or work toward. Like the best thing that I could hope for is that I would work really hard, move up the ladder and be that anchor who shows up 15 minutes before the broadcast and just reads on a microphone. Like, I don't want that. So TYT was totally different. It was irreverent. It was so unique at the time. And I was treated really well. I was treated as a human being. Like my opinions mattered from the beginning. I was a temp. And there was none of this, oh, you have to pay your dues before you go on air. Like the first day I was there, Cenk Uygur, who's the founder of the Young Turks, and he was also, you know, the main host. He's like, oh, we have a new intern. Let's bring her on. And I was like, I haven't paid my dues. You know, I can't be on air. But it was great. I really enjoyed it. And in the beginning, it was just a tiny crew of people, 5 in total. And it really did feel like a loyal family that looked out for each other. And I didn't make much money those days, but I miss those days big time.
I'm curious if you think people need to gain more experience and authority before they start showing their opinion to a bunch of people, because I know Ben Shapiro, not to bring him up again, but he always says that the dumbest stuff that he ever wrote was when he was young and in college at UCLA, and he was writing articles for the UCLA newspaper. Like he was saying some stuff that if he could go back in time, he would remove all of that stuff. And I know a lot of young people, like when I was between the ages of like 16 and probably 20, I thought I knew everything.
Of course,
and I was 100% happy to share that information with anybody that would listen to me.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little bit concerning now that anybody can go and purport to be an expert on anything and talk to thousands or hundreds.
That
of
has been a
people.
problem. And there is a distinction between people who might think they know it all and they're opining on things in a ignorant way versus those who are just like literal scammers and they're presenting themselves as experts when they're really not.
And how do you tell the difference between the two for a viewer?
I'm a big fan of Oppo research. So I'll research the hell out of someone before I trust them or trust what they're saying. And what I mean by that is, okay, well, what's your background? What is your experience that gives you the expertise necessary to comment on these things? Oftentimes you'll see various people quoted in print reports on various stories. And I'm like, this person certainly has a take. I wonder who they are and who they work for. Because unfortunately, today's journalism doesn't disclose some of the conflicts of interest involved with the sources that they rely on. So a lot of times people from think tanks get quoted and it's like, okay, well, this think tank has a partisan bent and the audience or the reader should be aware of that. So I look into that. Like, what are the affiliations? What are the associations? Does this person have a take that's informed from a political ideology? Doesn't mean that what they're saying should be thrown out the window, but at least you know that it's coming from a very specific perspective, and you should look out for opposing perspectives to have a more holistic approach to the story or understanding of the story.